Hi, this is Trevor Conkergood. Welcome to this week's RNK Software Club's video for the week. And our topic for this week is about pathing to avoid jumps and trims. And so if you're a digitizer and you like to create designs and you'd like to take control of the jumps and the trims, then this video is for you. And so let's go ahead and make my workspace nice and large and get started. And so I think the first thing I'll do is actually just use our shape tool and draw some kind of a rectangle and maybe even add on some kind of an ellipse. And let's just go ahead and select both and click on the fill tool to fill them in. And so currently what we have is two separate shapes and they don't touch each other. There's really no easy way to connect them. And so if you watch the stitching stitch out, it will sew the rectangle and then it will sew the circle. And at the end of the rectangle, notice if I turn off 3D, at the end of the rectangle, there will be a tie off, which is a series of stitches that kind of anchors the thread so that the machine can then trim the thread and the machine can jump, 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 jump until it gets to the next element where it will start with a tie-in stitch, which is essentially about 3 or 4 stitches, and then sew into the circle with the underlay and finally the cover stitch. And so essentially when you have two shapes and they're not touching, the software is going to need to stop and trim the thread in between. And if I select this shape and I click on the shape tool, so perhaps I can do that again from the beginning. If you use your select tool to select a shape, and then click on the shape tool. This is where you get the outline of the shape. You're able to interact with the yellow inclination line. You're able to interact with the blue shape points. And finally, you're able to interact with the red and green starting and stopping sewing point. And so notice that the red point is here, and pretty much that's where the dotted line starts. And so even though this segment is going to trim and jump, it doesn't seem entirely logical to finish it kind of in the middle of the line. I might have moved it to the corner, and had it start there. And so you'll notice now that I've done that, that the dotted line kind of jumps from this corner and jumps towards the circle. Now, I'm also going to stop and just use my select tool. So we have this rectangle selected. And I'm going to look to the properties box. And it's the tab that has a red X and a red circle that represents the commands. And I'm going to click on it and just point out that there are 4 options here. And 2 of them are the tie in, which is turned on as basic, and the tie off, which is turned on as basic. And you can take control of this. So that's the 4 stitches that I said at the beginning and the end of the rectangle. There will be a basic tie-in. There is an option for a triangle tie-in or no tie-in. And so you can make those changes. If you want to tell the software that at the end of this rectangle, after the tie-in, before jumping to the circle, you really want your machine to trim the thread, you can use the end command and change it from normal to trim. And that tells the software that you want to ensure that a trim command is added. And so if I say OK, then if we saved this design into a machine format and took it to our machine, not only would we have that 4 little sort of stitches that are at the end, the tie off, but we would expect the machine to activate the thread trim at this point. Now, the topic for the video is actually called pathing and how to avoid jumps and trims. But I wanted to start out just by explaining what jumps and trims are. And so the jump simply means that there is no stitching from here to here, and the machine is moving. Jump, 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 jump. And then, of course, here, so the dotted line tells me it's jumping, not stitching. And if I turn on our 3D view, any jump stitches are not shown because they are not part of the finished embroidery design. Now, pathing is the concept that if these 2 shapes were closer together, perhaps even touching, then we could plan to create the rectangle to finish sewing at the space where the circle could begin sewing, and that is called pathing. And to path these two together, there's two simple ways. One is to manually do it, which means you would use your shape tool, and you would turn on the shape tool, and you would move the red exit point to where it touches the blue circle. And then you would select the blue circle and use your shape tool to move the green entry point to match up with the previous red one. And then you could put your exit point. It might seem more logical to end your circle at either the top or the bottom. Top or bottom based upon the stitch direction being horizontal, so that being the top. Now when I right click, you'll notice that these are what's known as path together. So the rectangle will sew first, and it will sew in a sequence that breaks in the middle and then returns to the middle so that it can begin the next segment immediately upon finishing the first one. And in this situation, there's no need to trim between the circle and the square. And so this is where, if I come back to the properties box, the red tab for the commands, I purposely told it to trim, but if you leave this as normal, then this is going to be determined by the distance in between. And so I don't have to tell it to have a trim command. This way, the software can kind of decide if it needs one based upon the distance from the previous segment to the next segment. And also notice, if I'm doing this pathing and this connection, I really don't have to have the 4 stitches at the end of the square or the 4 stitches at the beginning of the circle. And it would be possible to select that rectangle and come to the commands and perhaps turn off the tie off to none. And then I could select the ellipse, and I could turn off the tie in to none. And so now there's no stitches at the end of the rectangle, no stitches, extra stitches at the beginning of the circle, and they truly are connected together, and there's no thread trimming involved. And so that is called pathing. Now, the good news is there's an even easier way to do that. And so perhaps what I could do is just use my rectangle tool to draw a rectangle. Let's go ahead and draw 2 rectangles. Let's go ahead and draw an ellipse and kind of have some fun with this. Why don't we even make a triangle? And so now I've got 4 segments, and it starts with a rectangle. Let's fill it in with thread, and another rectangle, fill that one in with thread, another, circle, fill, and triangle, fill. Now, when I filled these all in, the software simply assigned an entry and an exit point for me, and they do not know, they are not pathed together. So you can see that the red point is here, the green point is there. The very next one, the green point is here, the red point's there. They are not synced up. The next one is the circle. Its red point is here and its green point's here. Again, not where I probably want them. And just to prove, neither is the triangle. And so when you create segments, they do not automatically learn the most logical place to put their starting and entry points. They kind of make them just based on that one shape alone. But if I select all 4 of these shapes, so I'll just do it again, click off. I'm using the select tool, and I click and drag to select all 4 segments, and this is going to be determined by their sequence. And so they go, number 3 is the rectangle, number 4 is the second rectangle, number 5 is the circle, number 6 is the triangle, exactly how I made them. And so based on that, if I come up to the top, there's a button right here. It's called Optimize the Entry and Exit Points. So I don't have to stop and set them all. I can let the software do it. So when I clicked on Optimize Entry Exit Points, and if we watch it stitch out quickly now, you'll see that it'll start with the first rectangle, and that first rectangle will finish at a logical place to connect to the second rectangle. And now the second rectangle will start right there, and the second rectangle will finish at a place where it can connect to the ellipse. And the ellipse will finish where it can connect to the triangle. And so each segment had its entry point and its exit point adjusted. So the tool is here. It's called Optimize Entry and Exit. Now, Optimize Entry and Exit works great as long as the sequence is also great. And so really when we design, if we try to design the embroidery so that the first thing we make is what we want to sew first, and the second thing we make is what we want to sew second, and we kind of observe the sequence. So what I'm trying to say by that is if I make a rectangle and then I make the triangle and then I make the circle, and now I have three segments that all touch each other, but they aren't sequenced in the most logical way. And so if I click on optimize entry and exit, it's actually going to optimize the square for the best place to end to start the triangle. And the triangle, so the sequence will not be perfect. The sewing pathing will not be perfect for the last three because the sewing sequence was not perfect for the last three. And so to correct that, then we would need to simply change the sequence so that it did the rectangle. And then after that rectangle, we would want the ellipse. And so we can move the sewing sequence so that it sews in the logical order. And when I select these three, and now I click on optimize entry and exit, the square or the ellipse, the rectangle is optimized to the ellipse, and the ellipse is optimized to the triangle. And so now it's what we call all perfectly pathed together. You could select these segments, go into their commands, and essentially turn what you want to do is set it so that they have no tie-in and no tie-off. And that way, there's no additional stitches at the beginning and the ending of each object. And if you leave those little stitches on, I will say you will never notice them, and it's really not a problem, but you will avoid the jumps. And so this was a little bit of a technical video this week, and perhaps it will be very interesting for the digitizers in the group, maybe not for everyone. But we hope you enjoyed this week's RNK Software Club's video for the week. Until next week, thank you for watching, and bye for now.